I would like to acknowledge the 215 plus bodies that were discovered.
Mhm,
When they unearthed the bodies of the little children, they
mhm,
unearthed everything about
mhm,
what really is. It was like a confirmation that
mhm.
what we went through was true.
Meet Vera Jones, a survivor of 12 years as a child in the Canadian residential school system, a survivor of abuse and discrimination, and the stripping away of her culture, language, and identity by the Canadian government and church. I was very fortunate to spend a couple of hours with her, listening to her stories and experiences. I'll share these with you throughout this presentation, but before we get started, I ask you all to please bear witness. Learn. You must take the time to educate yourself about everything associated with residential schools, the terminology, the facts in history, and the effects. Not only the short term effects, but also the ongoing long term effects. Acknowledge. You must accept this as Canada's past and acknowledge that it always will be Canada's past. You must acknowledge the pain and suffering and the racism and inequality that Aboriginal peoples have experienced and are still experiencing today. You must support that this history must be shared and learned by all. You must support and help the healing of Aboriginal peoples and help stop the cycle of hate and discrimination. Pass it on. You must be truthful and share Canada's past about residential schools and the way Aboriginal peoples were treated. You must share your understanding with the people around you, your friends, and your family. You must share and talk with others so that they too can learn and acknowledge our true history. Now please, as this video begins, bear witness. It is the only way we will spread the well-needed and well-deserved awareness. Let's begin. We all know about the existence of residential schools in Canadian history, especially given they've been in the headlines so much in the past year, with hundreds, if not thousands, of graves of children recently found. Unmarked graves, that is. We are aware that students experience extreme physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, and are aware of some of the ramifications that Indigenous peoples are still dealing with today, and will be for countless more years. But let's be honest, how much do you really know, and are you willing to take the time to learn more? Now, before we get started on the details, let's go over some terminology that will help with your understanding. The term residential schools refers to an extensive school system set up by the Canadian government and administered by churches with the objective of educating Indigenous children, but with the more damaging objective of indoctrinating them into Euro-Canadian and Christian culture and assimilating them into mainstream white Canadian society. The term Aboriginal refers to the first inhabitants of Canada and includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. It came into popular usage in Canada after 1982 when the Canadian Constitution defined the term as such. First Nations is a term used to describe Aboriginal peoples of Canada who are not Métis or Inuit. This term came into common usage in the 1970s and 80s and generally replaced the term Indian. Although, unlike Indian, this term does not have a legal definition. Inuit is a term that refers to specific groups of people generally living in the far north who are not considered Indians under Canadian law. Métis refers to cultures and ethnic identities that resulted from unions and relationships between First Nations and European people in what is now Canada. This term has both general and specific uses, and the differences between them are often contentious. It is sometimes used as a general term to refer to people of mixed ancestry, whereas in a legal context, it refers to descendants of specific historic communities. The term Indian refers to the legal identity of a First Nations person who was registered under the Indian Act. It is used when referring to a First Nations person with status under this act. Aside from this specific legal context, this term in Canada is considered outdated and offensive to many First Nations peoples. Indigenous is a term used to encompass a variety of Aboriginal groups. It is most frequently used in an international, transnational, or global context. This term came into wide usage during the 1970s when Aboriginal groups organized transnationally and pushed for greater presence in the United Nations. Native is a general term that refers to a person or thing that has originated from a particular place. The term Native does not denote to a specific Aboriginal ethnicity, such as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. In Canada, the term Aboriginal and Indigenous is generally preferred to the word Native. Most feel that Native has a negative connotation and is outdated. The Indian Act was created in 1876. Its main goal was to force First Nations peoples to give up their culture and identity and to assimilate them into Euro-Canadian culture. A band, or Indian Band, is a governing unit of Indians in Canada instituted by the Indian Act. It is defined by the Indian Act as a group of Indians. Although many bands prefer to be called First Nations, as the term Indian is considered offensive and outdated. Enfranchisement is a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status and conferring full Canadian citizenship. Now that you all know some general terms that will help with your further understanding, it is time to go into the causes, early history, short-term and long-term effects of residential schools. Churches and European settlers brought with them the assumption that their own civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement. They interpreted the socio-cultural differences between themselves and Indigenous peoples as proof that Canada's first inhabitants were ignorant, savage, and in need of guidance. They felt the need to civilize the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and education became the primary means to this end. Canada's Prime Minister at the time, John A. Macdonald, commissioned journalist and politician Nicholas Flood Davin to study industrial schools for Indigenous children in the United States. Davin's recommendation to follow the U.S.'s example of quote-unquote aggressive civilization led to the public funding for the residential school system. In his 1879 Report on Industrial Schools for Indians and Half-Breeds, Davin wrote, "If anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within the circle of civilized conditions." In the 1880s, the government began to establish residential schools all across Canada. Authorities would take children from their homes and usually take them to schools far from their communities as part of a strategy to alienate them from their families and familiar surroundings. In 1920, under the Indian Act, it became mandatory for every Indigenous child to attend a residential school and illegal for them to attend any other educational institution. The government used various legislative means to wield power and control over Aboriginal peoples, the Indian Act being one of them. The Indian Act came to be over time, through separate pieces of colonial legislation regarding Aboriginal peoples across Canada, such as the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857 and the Gradual Enfranchisement Act of 1869. It was in 1876 when these acts were consolidated as the Indian Act. The Gradual Civilization Act was sought to assimilate Indian people into Canadian settler society by encouraging enfranchisement, which was a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status and conferring to full Canadian citizenship. This act was a failure as very few people voluntarily enfranchised. The federal government created the Gradual Enfranchisement Act in 1869, which established the elective band council system that remains in the Indian Act to this day. The Gradual Enfranchisement Act also granted the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs extreme control over status Indians. The superintendent had the power to determine who was of good moral character and therefore deserved certain benefits. In 1884, under the Indian Act, the federal government banned potlucks along with other important traditional ceremonies. The potluck was one of the most important ceremonies for coastal First Nations in the West. What is a potluck, you may ask? It is a ceremony integral to the governing structure, culture, and spiritual traditions of various First Nations living on the northwest coast and in parts of the interior western subarctic. Its primary function is to redistribute wealth, confer status and rank upon individuals, and to establish claims to names, powers, and rights to hunting and fishing territories. The non-native colonists saw this sharing of wealth and food as excessive and wasteful. They realized how important it was in sustaining First Nations cultures, which gave them the reason to ban them. When Aboriginal political organizing became more extensive in the 1920s and groups began to pursue land claims, the federal government added Section 141 to the Indian Act. Section 141 outlawed the hiring of lawyers and legal counsel by Indians, effectively stopping Aboriginal peoples from fighting for their rights through the legal system. Now that you know some of the causes that led up to residential schools and some of their causes and repercussions, let's see what residential schools really are. The residential school system operated from the 1880s into the late 1900s, with the last one not closing until 1996. They were run by the church and supported by the government. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were forcibly removed from their families and communities for extended periods of time and were forbidden to acknowledge their Indigenous heritage and culture and to speak their own language. Children were severely punished if these, among other strict rules, were broken. The purpose of residential schools was to eliminate all aspects of Indigenous culture from the children's lives. Students had their hair cut short. They were dressed in uniforms. They were often given numbers, and their days were strictly regimented. Boys and girls were kept separate, and even siblings rarely interacted, further weakening family ties and culture. Over 150,000 children were taken from their families. Most of them suffered from severe physical, emotional, and/or sexual abuse. There was a 40 to 60% mortality rate at residential schools, with children dying of malnutrition, abuse, disease, and even neglect. The actual number of deaths is unknown, as there are no true records of this, and with the recent findings of hundreds to thousands of children's graves, the number is sadly rising. In my interview with Vera, she shared many of her experiences with me, and to hear firsthand what she went through is very unsettling. She describes both emotional and physical abuse. She spent the first 9 years at St. George's Residential School outside Lytton before being moved to St. Michael's at Alert Bay. Despite there being 132 girls at her school, she describes her bed as her best friend. She learned to follow the rules and to listen quickly. There was no socializing and no nurturing adult relationships. It was lonely and she was terrified to break the rules, so she always kept to herself. She did not learn how to have normal childhood friendships and found that some of the other children became very mean to each other due to this environment. Physically, she was hit with straps. At one point, she was strapped over the head multiple times. Due to this, she lost her hearing. Of course, there was no medical aid provided, and she lived with hearing loss well into her adult life before finally having surgery. She knew of girls who were sexually assaulted. They were told they were the pretty ones. There are countless of these stories, some of which have and will never be told. In 2007, a multi-billion-dollar class action suit against the government of Canada, brought by thousands of those who experienced abuse and neglect at these schools, was approved and settled. The Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement was the largest class action settlement in Canada and provided not only compensation for survivors and their families to help in their recovery, but was an important first step in reconciliation. From this Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement came the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, or the TRC. The purpose of the TRC was to learn the impact of residential schools and to facilitate reconciliation among former students, their families, and all Canadians. One of their main goals was to educate the Canadian public about the truth and history of these schools and share the experiences of students and their families. Its mandate included the truth-telling and reconciliation process as part of an overall holistic and comprehensive response to the Indian residential school legacy is a sincere indication and acknowledgement of the injustices and harms experienced by Aboriginal people and the need for continued healing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada spent 6 years traveling across Canada listening to survivors and their families about their experiences. They heard from over 6,500 witnesses and created a historical record of the residential school system. The TRC also hosted 7 national events to engage the Canadian public and to educate others about the history of the schools and to share and honor the experiences of those affected. The records and all documentation are at the National Centre of Truth and Reconciliation. In June 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada presented a summary of their findings in Ottawa, in which they included 94 calls to action to help continue reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. This presentation was a historic event as survivors had their stories told, a powerful tool to help with the healing and in reconciliation, helping society rebuild relationships. Reconciliation can only work if everyone works towards it, and being informed and educated helps us to understand what further steps need to be taken. For Vera, although she is happy that reconciliation is taking place, she finds it is a very slow process and wishes progress was quicker. As for helping her with her own trauma, she doesn't feel it has helped, but she does feel some relief that the world knows her truth. She feels that people will now finally believe their stories and that people will finally stop saying, "Get over it." She believes now that they will understand why it is so hard to just simply get over it. We all know September 30th as Orange Shirt Day, which is an Indigenous-led day honoring children of residential schools. In 2021, Parliament came to the decision to make September 30th a statutory holiday as the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. The orange shirt comes from an experience of a young girl named Phyllis Webstad, who, on her first day of attending a residential school, had her orange shirt taken away from her. This came to symbolize the stripping away of culture, freedom, and self-esteem that so many experienced as students at residential schools. September 30th reminds us each year of what went on and reminds us to pay tribute and honor not only survivors, but all those who lost their lives at these schools. Before we get into ongoing and long-term effects, I would like to just quickly give one more definition of a word that will help with your further understanding. Historical intergenerational trauma is trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group that is related to major events of oppression that is passed down through generations. The Government of Canada continues its work of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The mandate for the TRC pointed out that reconciliation is an ongoing individual and collective process and will require commitment from all those affected. The government states that they recognize that to achieve change, Indigenous nations need to be self-determining, self-governing, self-sufficient, and no longer want to be marginalized, regulated, and administered. They acknowledge that cultural traditions and customs, including language, are fundamental to rebuilding Indigenous nations, all of which were stripped away at residential schools. As mentioned previously, the TRC's report noted 94 calls to action in their final summary for ongoing reconciliation. These provide for ongoing mutually respectful and meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples. For example, they state such things as making sure Aboriginal people have equitable access to jobs, training, and education, and their communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic projects. The residential school system is viewed by much of the Canadian public as part of a distant past, dissociated from today's events. This is not the case. The last residential school didn't close until 1996, and many of the leaders, teachers, parents, and grandparents of today's Indigenous communities are residential school survivors. Despite their closure, the effects of residential schools are ongoing for both survivors and their descendants who share the intergenerational trauma. Residential schools isolated Indigenous children from their families and communities, and stripped away their language, culture, and identities. When they returned home, they didn't know how to cope in the world. The psychological, spiritual, physical, and sexual abuse they were subjected to has had catastrophic effects on their mental and physical health throughout their lives. Some examples of their continuing long-term effects on survivors and their families are heightened feelings of anger and anxiety, low self-esteem and depression, PTSD, higher rates of chronic diseases such as diabetes, high rates of suicide, and high rates of substance abuse. Residential schools did not provide a nurturing environment. Students did not learn healthy parenting models, so when they themselves became parents, they weren't prepared. According to the report on the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba, several generations of Indigenous peoples were denied the development of parenting skills, not only by the removal from their communities and families, but also from the severe lack of attention paid to them by school officials. High numbers of families of survivors went on to experience family violence and domestic abuse. An outfall from this is an overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the welfare system and government care. Generations of children don't experience and learn positive and nurturing family life. Vera is a very good example of this. She is 75 years old, and her life since leaving residential schools has been a difficult one. She blamed her parents for sending her away. She was 5 years old and felt abandoned. So when she went home, her relationship with them, especially with her dad, as he was the one who dropped her off, was never the same. It forever changed her relationship with her parents. She felt estranged from them after being 12 years away. Vera didn't share her abuse when she returned home. She didn't tell them as she didn't want to get in trouble. And residential schools taught her what happens when you get in trouble. Vera became very resentful and turned to alcohol as it made her feel better. She realizes now that as a young adult she never grew up or matured, as she never experienced what a normal life was or was given the right tools. She found all interactions and relationships difficult. She didn't know how to communicate or build a healthy relationship. She says she struggled with this all her life. She has 3 children, but she had never learned how to parent or how to nurture. Again, she had never seen healthy parenting models. She struggled as a mom, and in the end, her children were put into government care. Vera actually gave up custody as she didn't know how to care for them. One of her children committed suicide, and Vera feels responsible for this. She feels like she failed as a mother. She holds incredible regret for this and says the guilt and regret will never go away. She does now have a relationship with her other 2 children and is in very close contact with her grandchildren. Vera takes responsibility for her past, but she also blames the government and residential schools as she was never given the opportunity in those key younger years to experience and learn about healthy relationships. It's very easy to see how the trauma is passed from generation to generation. You end up with a whole society affected by hopelessness, anger, and sadness, which in return leads to further traumatic situations, such as high levels of unemployment, disproportionate number of Indigenous in the justice system, homelessness, poor housing, and the list goes on. And residential schools are the root cause of such far-reaching trauma. Several generations of Indigenous peoples attended residential schools in Canada, and the schools have caused so much trauma that healing will take several generations, more than those who attended. One of the most basic first steps of healing is others acknowledging the trauma experienced, and acknowledging the ongoing effects which began with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Researchers and those who have studied residential schools suggest that to move forward, Indigenous peoples need to be empowered through increased self-government and self-determination. We need to be aware that society also plays a large role in perpetuating intergenerational trauma through racism and economic and cultural discrimination. We need to do better. We need to support Indigenous peoples in the process of reconciliation. Learning the history and understanding the far-reaching and long-term effects of residential schools will help end racism and discrimination. The purpose of this presentation is to educate and hopefully open people's minds to learn more and to understand that this issue is very complex. We need to do our part to continue the process of reconciliation. We need to support organizations who support survivors and their families. We need to take the time to reflect and acknowledge this sad history and share stories of what actually went on. We need to demand that the calls for action as summarized by the TRC be met. Only 10 of the 94 were met as of 2021. And we need to demand action from our government that Indigenous peoples be treated equally and respectfully. Some of who do not even have clean drinking water in their communities. And reconciliation will not move forward with things like this happening. Vera, at age 75, is still working. She works for an organization that supports residential school survivors. She absolutely loves her job working with the elders and says through her job she has finally learned to communicate and build healthy relationships, of which she is very proud. As you may know, Indigenous communities all across Canada are grieving after the discovery of thousands of unmarked graves of children at old residential school sites. And as Canadians, we must grieve with them. And let me remind you, with the bodies that were discovered, when they were unearthed, everything was unearthed. It was a confirmation that what Indigenous peoples went through was true.
We were worlds apart from each other,
Mm-hmm.
worlds apart, even though we were all, like we had a big dorm where the young girls were in a big dormitory. But my whole world was just my bed, in the dorm. There was no hanging out with each other. You know how nowadays, you get ready for bed and you hang out with your siblings, you talk with them and stuff, and your parents. But that was not in my case. You know, not talking was my survival mode as well, because as much as I wanted to say things, I couldn't say anything.
Yeah, you just get
Because
silence.
I would I would get hit across the head, or they would hit me with a ruler or a strap or something. Just because I opened my mouth and I said something. So,
Mm-hmm.
well, first of all, I was very hard of hearing because, well,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't really hear because
Yeah.
the supervisor at the residential school, when she got me across the ear, she got my head, she got me right in my ear, and
Mm-hmm.
I could hear something pop, and then I couldn't hear anybody. And she did
Mm-hmm.
the same on my right side at another time. And so not being able to hear didn't help any kind of relationship with
Yeah.
anybody,
Mm-hmm.
so there was virtually no communications coming out of me at all,
Mm-hmm.
so I ended up storing a lot of feelings. So I turned to alcohol so I wouldn't feel those awful feelings. And
Mm-hmm.
alcohol seemed to work for me, that because I didn't have to feel those feelings. I could be okay and happy. That's what alcohol did for me,
Mm-hmm.
was took away those horrible feelings that were sitting
Yeah.
inside. I didn't know that, once I put the bottle down, those feelings were going to come back. I didn't know anything about that. And I never got the proper guidance as a young child, as a young adult,